Well, hi, everybody, and welcome to the Cultural Studies podcast. My name is Toby Miller, and my guest today is
Sheila Sofian. I'm an independent filmmaker. I'm also a professor in the Expanded Animation Research and Practice program and the School of Cinematic Arts at USC.
wonderful. Thank you so much. For those outside the US, that's University of Southern California.
That's correct, yes.
There is also University of South Carolina, and I
Right.
sometimes people get confused between the two.
It's true. Yeah.
They're on opposite sides of the country. I lived many years in LA, and I miss it like crazy. So, Prof, I wanted to begin with my stereotypical query that I pose to everybody, which is to ask what's currently dynamizing, impeding, interesting, preoccupying you? What's going on for the prof?
Well, for me, dynamizing, I really have to say, is my students and our alums too, because we're going through some transitions right now in our program, and they have come together in an incredible way, and they're so inspiring, and they're so passionate about their work and about the program, and it's been incredibly dynamizing to witness and to bond with the students and alums in this way. In terms of impeding, I should reveal that our program, Expanded Animation Research and Practice, has just been terminated about 2 months ago. And so this is the last semester that we have this program in existence. But I'm very proud of what we've accomplished. We won the Student Academy Award last year. We won $500,000 in grants, and our students are incredible. And I hope to stay in touch with them. And then in terms of interesting, I think in general, I think, the world order right now is just so devastating, but also I'm so impressed by people who are resisting and the courage of people to stand up to it. I'm just so impressed by people and how people have put their bodies at risk for a greater cause. So for me, I'm just constantly awed by the humanity of people and the courage of people.
And that's wonderful. And I think it brings together work, emotion, and the world in a powerful, powerful sense. And when we were chatting before recording, I said I didn't want to push you too much on these things. But can I ask you what it's like at a feelings level to see the program come to a close?
It's devastating because it's a young program and all the faculty, we put so much of ourselves into it. And I feel like we were successful. And so it was a shock that this decision was made. But most importantly, it was, devastating for the students. Most of them are international students who have come halfway across the world to attend this program, and it's not being sunsetted. They're just being told, no more classes in this program. The faculty are gone, the staff are gone, and you have to just take classes in other programs or transfer to another division. So it's devastating. And the faculty are so worried about the students are so worried about the faculty, and we're a very small, intimate program. We all know each other very well, but it's definitely brought us together. As one student called it, trauma bonding.
Trauma bonding, I like.
Yeah.
Yeah, of course. So thank you for sharing that with us. And before we get on to the specifics of your own productions, this inevitably draws me towards a question I wanted to put to you anyway, which is the current state of animation. Because this is one of the areas of filmmaking and television that's gone through the most radical technological transformations over the past century imaginable. All the other ones that everybody went through, plus several more. And you touch on those questions in some of your work. You literally incarnate some of them in some of your work. Could you give us a brief tour d'horizon, a general image of where animation is today and some of the struggles that it's confronting?
Are you thinking of mainstream animation?
Obviously I'm thinking of the industry in inverted commas.
Right. Okay.
But not only the industry, because it's not necessarily totally disarticulated from the independent sector in
Right.
terms of technology and people and genres. There has often been some interaction across those boundaries, although those boundaries I think are real. But please problematize my question too. You don't have to
Sure.
accept it obviously
No.
in its own terms.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think what you may be inferring is the advent of AI and how that's affecting animation in general, in terms of technology. And it's an interesting question, and I think there's a lot of aspects to it.
Mm.
I think definitely a lot of the major studios are hoping that AI can replace workers, and that it will be in a very efficient way to produce work. And I think that they're running into some obstacles because there have been over and over again, studios have fired a lot of artists and then had to rehire them when they're finding out that they actually need them to create the work. Uh, but in terms of the aesthetics, the way I see it, I think of AI as sort of another genre or another form of filmmaking, the way there's CG and stop motion and
Mm.
drawn animation. It's just such a different look. I can't imagine everybody just gravitating to that one look, you know. I
Yeah.
don't think the public has that appetite, you know. I mean, I certainly don't. Um, so I think that the predictions of AI kind of taking over are a little bit exaggerated. I
Mm.
think it's definitely going to influence everything, especially with workflow and efficiency. There's a lot of ways AI is going to affect the industry and affect filmmaking and affect independent and industry filmmakers. But I don't think it will, take over everything. I think that it will be a tool that people can use, some to greater or lesser degrees. But in terms of, the few films I've seen that have been entirely AI, they have not yet reached a point, in my opinion, where you feel it's just not effective. You don't feel the humanity in it. It's not,
Mm.
to me, it's very uninteresting so far, but that, might change.
If we go back, as they say in baseball commentary, Prof.
Uh-huh.
Sheila, a long, long way to the early days of filmmaking, physical drawing was an important part of animation, and painting has been an important part of your animation.
Right.
Can you tell us about that, a little bit about that history and how it affects you, how you have the desire actually not just to use computer-aided design, but to consider that artwork that was being done in the very early days of cinema up until the 40s, 30s, 40s as the norm, right?
Right.
Right? I think it's fair to say. But it's still something that you're involved in and so on. Can you
Right.
tell us a bit about that history, both at the wider level and in terms of your own practice?
Yes, I mean, when I was learning animation, both in undergraduate and graduate school, it was all on celluloid film and it was all hand drawn.
Mm.
Computers didn't enter the equation until long after I had graduated grad school.
Okay.
And so we first started using computers to record drawn animation and eventually to draw directly on the computer. And I did play with that with Flash animation originally. Amiga computers, there was a paint program that was one of the very first ones. And I never got into CG animation myself, but I did play with digital drawn animation, which was fun. But in terms of my own work, I have a big attachment to either drawn or paint analog. I did the last film I made I was actually on the computer. It was TV Paint software, and I was trying to make it look like paint. I was trying to get that texture, but ultimately it wasn't as satisfying because I found out that it's I had too much control over every pixel, whereas with paint it's more collaborative with the medium, and sometimes it'll do surprising things and I'll kind of go in that direction, and it's just really enjoyable for me to play with that and also to get that kind of tactile texture. And I feel like it's much more evocative and much more interesting than, flat drawing would be. I don't know if that answers your question.
That's beautiful, thanks. And I hadn't realized it had taken that long for the thing to become more mechanized. I wanted to pick up on a particular remark you made there, which is fascinating. That, in a sense, the more technology got involved, at some level, if I heard you right, you had more control and the
Yes,
less. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yes, with drawn animation, with this last film I was working on with, which is a software called TV Paint, I could be, you could be very intentional on every pixel that you draw, and you can add layers and you can do all kinds of interesting things, and there are effects, etc. But with paint, it's much more unpredictable. You never know kind of what the water and the paint or how they're going to react, and it gives you ideas. So while I'm painting, I'll see something and then go, oh yeah, I'll go in that direction. With the software, I have to tell it everything. Like this is where we're going, this is how we're going to do it. And that's fun for some things, I think, but for my own personal work, I really love this more collaborative process with the medium. Because it's just so much more interesting, and I get results that I would never have done if it was just left up to me, and if I was in control of it completely.
Now, your independent work has covered very difficult themes in many cases, and quite avant-garde themes as well. And your industrial professional work, more on the popular culture side of things. I wondered if we could talk a little bit about those two bits of your work and the interaction that they do or don't have.
I don't know that there's an interaction between the two. I haven't focused on the professional work. I worked in the industry for a year doing flash animation for internet content. And it was not for me creatively fulfilling, but it was an interesting process to get to know the industry. I did a lot of freelance work. One was animation for a film called Closet Land many, many years ago. I've done some title sequences, an MTV ID, but those were a long time ago. I haven't sought out commercial work anytime recently. My own work, I do gravitate towards more serious themes. Like domestic violence and war and wrongful conviction and that kind of thing. But that's just something that I'm very much drawn to. Like I'm curious about it, I want answers to, and so the documentary allows me to ask these questions and search for answers.
And tell me about that meshing of documentary and animation, because for many of us, animation means cartoon. And cartoon means fun, comedy, childhood, right? But it's much more serious in your hands.
Yes, I think animation has been kind of segregated into children's medium, in modern day society. And it always has, for us independent filmmakers, that's always been a bit of a struggle, because people perceive it that way. I remember describing a film I was working on many years ago, that was this black and white film called Secret Rage. And it's about, the internal struggle this man goes through. And the response I got from somebody I met was, oh, that doesn't sound like it's for children. And it's true. None of my films are for children. But, as far as documentary goes, there's even a lot of mainstream films that are using the documentary as a tool. Michael Moore has often used documentary in his films. And there have been entirely animated documentaries that are feature length as well, Flea and Waltz with Bashir and Persepolis. So I think it's starting to become a little bit more prevalent. I can't say of course, no editing in this podcast.
No editing, but
it's prevalent. Prevalent was the word I was trying to spit out.
Sounds good, Prof. You got there.
So it's starting to become more prevalent. You start to see it a lot more. but it's not, it's true that most people don't associate animation with serious topics. For me, it came very naturally because I was very interested in documentary, I was very interested in social science, and I was very interested in animation, and it just sort of naturally came together.
Emerged. So going back to some of the topics you've already mentioned, it's 30 years just about since Survivors was produced.
Yeah.
And it's a very affecting, chilling graphic that is given to us. I wonder if you could talk a bit about that. It may be that you haven't seen it for a while.
No, I feel very comfortable talking about it.
Right.
So that film actually started out as a live action film in undergraduate school, because we were to make a documentary, and I had been volunteering at this shelter for women who were victims of domestic violence. And I thought their stories were so important, and I really wanted to record them, but they didn't want to be identified, so I recorded them in silhouette. And so it was talking heads in silhouette, and visually it wasn't very interesting. And my teacher kind of wanted me to go out there and follow them and get more interesting footage, but that was someplace I didn't want to go with that film. So I never finished it. And then I went to CalArts for graduate school, and I made for my thesis film a documentary film where I interviewed my niece about her newborn sister. And that was the first time I made a film with a documentary soundtrack. And I was actually speaking to a friend about this other film that I never finished, and she said, well, why don't you make it a documentary animation? And it never even occurred to me. So I resurrected those interviews, and at that time I got a job offer in Philadelphia. So I moved there, and I met some experts in domestic violence, and they introduced me to people that they worked with who were victims. So I did many, many more interviews. And then I was able to eventually get it down to 16-minute audio cut. And then I decided to use drawn animation with Conti crayons to animate it. And that film took about 4 years to do. It's 10,000 drawings. And it's so interesting because the process of making a film is so different from the process of showing it and the reaction that you get. Because you're so close to it, you get kind of immune to it, day after day for 4 years. And although I think, it does weigh on you while you're making the film. But then when I start to show it, I was so surprised at the strong reaction that it was getting. And almost every single screening I've been to, people have shared their own experiences with me. And that's one thing that I think animated documentary has a lot of potential to do. I think there's something about getting at the emotional truth, of what the person is saying, trying to interpret what they're saying in a way that that really connects with people. It's very visceral, and I think a lot of times it's very relatable for people. It's like you're not separated by a filter of like a realistic imagery. I think you can become absorbed into it much more. And that's what I was finding, that people were so impacted by it. It's really interesting to me. And I think that animation paired with documentary can be very, very powerful.
Oh, for sure. And onto another topic that you mentioned en passant. And this is, I think, a more recent one, again, very moving. Disabled, a love story. This is from now, pretty much, right?
Right. Yeah, this is my husband's brother and his wife.
Oh, okay.
And that's the film that was animated using digital animation.
Can you tell us a little bit about that? So this is also very personal.
Yes.
One is about working in a shelter and finding ways over many years to represent that in a sensitive but also powerful way. And this is about a family struggle.
Right. And I've always been so impressed with my sister-in-law and my brother-in-law. And when I first met them, my sister-in-law, Terry, was diagnosed with MS. And, at first she could walk fine, but she was having pains in her legs. And eventually she could no longer walk. And then she lost the use of one arm and then the other. And then she was eventually fully bedridden. And so it's been a very long process, and her husband has slowly become her full-time caregiver. And the whole struggle and the way she has been so strong throughout it all, and him as well, and the way they were able to maintain their relationship through all this has been so I've been so impressed by. And so I've always wanted to make a film about them, and they agreed to let me. And it was kind of good that I did when I did, because she could no longer really speak, and at that time her voice was relatively strong. And she's so smart. She's a professor, or was a professor at MIT. She worked in urban planning, and she's just brilliant. And her husband is a writer, and he's brilliant, and they're very articulate and honest and willing to share, their experiences to the fullest. And originally I was just going to make the film about her, what it's like to lose your body. I thought, it could be interesting with the animation, but through her work, I mean, she was teaching even up to the point where she was almost fully immobilized. So she had this very complicated wheelchair that would allow her to go in and co-teach with somebody else. Um, and she's found that it didn't really serve her well to complain. So it's really hard for her to sort of complain or talk about the difficulties that she was having. And then I decided to interview her husband as well. And then the film started to become really more about their relationship. So that's why it ended up being Disabled, a Love Story. Because I thought that was the interesting thread throughout the whole film.
And she's now in a position where direct participation would have been very difficult.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
And you and your husband have been living with this at one remove for a very considerable time.
Mm-hmm.
And to be able to document and understand another couple's love is really something.
Yeah. Yeah. It really is. And they're such impressive people, both of them. And they trusted me. It's a lot to hand over your story to somebody else to visualize for you, So and it's also, for all of my films, it's kind of a little risky in that if they disapproved of the results, it would be devastating. If they didn't think I represented them accurately or the way they intended, that would be, that was not my objective to misinterpret them in any way. It's more to try to sort of translate what they're going through, And so thank goodness they were happy with the results. They felt like it captured their truth.
On to another theme of social importance that you touched on, Prof. And this is animation through painting on glass. It's an hour-long film, Truth Has Fallen, about a topic and treated in a way that is overwhelming, at least for me. Could you share with us a little bit about how that film works and its gestation?
Absolutely. At that time, it overlapped a little bit with Survivors. I was finishing that film up, and I was living in Philadelphia, and I read an article about James McCloskey, who is somebody who had started this organization called Centurion Ministries, and he investigates cases of people he believes were wrongfully convicted. And it was an article about him and James Baker, who had just been released from prison after 25 years for a crime he did not commit. And I was so impressed by both of them, by this man who had endured so much, and also by James McCloskey, who did not give up and fought for him to be released. And at that time, this was like in the mid 90s when I first started, work on this film. The internet had just started like happening. So there was like text only. So I tried, not Google, but search, for James McCloskey's information. I was able to find his phone number, and I contacted him. And he was wonderful. And he introduced me to people he represented. And because he had done so much for them, they were happy to talk with me. And then ultimately I ended up hiring a producer who helped me put me in touch with the experts in the film, like Vincent Bugliosi, who wrote Helter Skelter and prosecuted Charles Manson.
Right.
And and several other people that I would not have been able to reach otherwise that were experts in that area. And so I started out with the audio interviews, and that film was an hour long, so it was much more ambitious than any other film that I've worked on. And I made the decision to do half animated and half live action photography. So that was also a new way of working for me. That was a big kind of hurdle. Um, and so I started out with the live action and I shot that. And then I decided that painting on glass was the best medium to match the live action. I felt like drawn animation would be too light in comparison to the live action. I didn't want it to be distracting. So I decided to go with painting on glass. So that film took more than 10 years to make ultimately. And for that film, I decided to use painting on glass for the people who had been wrongfully convicted because I think you empathize more with the animation. And for the expert testimony, I thought the live action would be okay because you could be a little bit more removed from it. But there were some exceptions. For example, when they were describing DNA evidence, that made sense to show it animated so you could kind of understand what they were talking about a little bit more. But it seemed to work. I tried very hard to mesh the two together by having transitions that were textured and color timing the imagery to try to make it match more. So it was a huge learning experience. And yeah, ultimately, I think if I were to do live action again, there were some things I would do differently, but I did learn a lot doing it. So yeah, that was definitely my most ambitious film to date.
For me, it gets at one of the tragedies of the United States, which is like other authoritarian countries, China, Iran, it has this huge carceral population. Without ever recognizing the fact that so many people are incarcerated for non-violent crimes, and that so many people incarcerated for violent reasons are innocent or come disproportionately from particular social groups. At the same time, it's also a place where, going back in time, Errol Morris, for example, there is a long tradition of documentary filmmakers considering this, and actually Warner Brothers' social conscience cinema of the 30s and 40s, trying to explain it in fictional form, and resistance from those within prison. So on the one hand, there's this horrendous reality of how that set of systems works. On the other, there's this remarkable truth project to try to free, to liberate those wrongfully convicted, and to try to understand criminology in a social and cultural form. And that brings me on very much to an infinitely shorter film of yours that I recently watched, Waving the Flag, where the word that people in the US use so often, patriotism, is both embraced and problematized. And the word that people never want to use in the United States, I think, isn't uttered, which is nationalism. And I'm a US citizen, though I don't sound like it. And the part of the United States that is most terrifying for me is its nationalism. But in any event, that's about me. Waving the Flag is just 4 minutes long. It's incredibly moving in its ambiguity and ambivalence. Could you share with us something again about it as a text and how it came to be?
Absolutely. That was partly in reaction to the reaction I received from my previous film, which you might want to touch on, which was a conversation with Harris, which became politicized, and which was a surprise to me. I didn't anticipate that. So then I thought, well, I'm just going to make a political film. They're going to accuse me of making a political film. And this was a collaboration with a spoken word artist. Her name is Harriet Mullen, a professor from UCLA. And so we decided to make this film together. It was part of a larger series of artworks from Newtown, Pasadena, an art organization. And this was actually the first time I think I made a film using digital means. And so I photographed her doing all kinds of things, and I manipulated those photographs and I animated them. And in this film, the only music is towards the end. It's really just her voice. There's no sound design. It's her voice, which I think is very powerful and carries the film,
Yeah.
and me interpreting it with these visuals. And then her nephew, who was very young, did this really interesting soundtrack for the end credits. So that was an enjoyable experience. That's really the only collaborative film that I've made in terms of being really creatively collaborative. And I really enjoyed working with this other artist whose work I thought was very powerful. But yes, we had decided, because she created the poem for this film, and when we sat down to think about what we wanted to do, what we wanted to say, the Iraq War was going on. We both had very strong feelings about it, and about the consumerism and patriotism and everybody waving the flag and monetizing it, and like this whole fever of patriotism. And so we both felt very much like we wanted to make art about that, say something about that.
Absolutely. And of course, Professor Mullen is an extraordinary artist in her own right.
Yes.
You've already led me into what I was going to ask about, which is Harris,
Yes.
a young Serbian immigrant.
Bosnian.
Bosnian.
Yeah.
I apologize.
No worries.
I apologize to you and to people of both places. Very distinct and yet overlapping stories. A bad mistake on my part. Can you tell us about it as you made it, and then about the controversy that sparked?
So I met this family because my sister was helping them learn English. They moved to, this was a young Bosnian family who had to leave Bosnia during the war. And they first moved to Germany, so they had learned German, and my sister knew German, and then they had to move to the United States after that. And originally I wanted it to be about like an American immigrant story, because she was a nurse, but all of her, certifications had been destroyed in the war. And so she couldn't practice nursing in the United States, and her husband was a choreography for traditional Bosnian dances, and he was having to deliver pizza and work in a factory, and they were struggling. And so I thought that was an interesting story, but they didn't speak English well enough to interview them. But their son, who was 11 years old, had only been here for 6 months, and he spoke fluent English. So I ended up interviewing him, and then the story changed. It was very much like when you interview a younger person, they don't, you can't ask one prompt and then they go off. He kind of just answered each question, which is why I had to use my voice, even though I hadn't mic'd for my voice, so that you understood the context of what he was saying. So it became much more directly about the experience of the war and moving to the United States after that. So yeah, I made this film, and it was painting on glass animation. They felt very accurately represented. They really appreciated the film. And then I started to show it. And the first time I showed it was at the Aspen Shorts Fest. And that's a great film festival where, they host the filmmakers and you stay there for a week. But since I was working full time, I could only come towards the end of that week. And my film was shown in a program with a USC filmmaker. At that time, I was not teaching at USC, but it was a USC filmmaker who made a live action film about the Serbian-Bosnian War from a Serbian perspective. And in his film, this person had been hit on the head with a hammer. In my film, the same thing happened, but it was from the other perspective. And the audience kind of turned on him during the Q&A, and it became a difficult, like the way it was programmed was really unfortunate. And then after that, the filmmakers who had all kind of bonded kind of turned on me. And so they started interrogating me about the film, saying that it wasn't balanced. I should have interviewed a Serbian boy as well to give a different perspective, that I should have not ask such leading questions, and that it was manipulative to use a young boy, all kinds of things, like questions that I hadn't anticipated. And so it was it was, it never, and people thought of it sort of as propaganda, which never even occurred to me. I was just curious about his experience. And I felt like, if I were to interview a Serbian boy alongside him, I thought it would take away from his own story. It was about him. It was about his story. It wasn't a documentary about the Balkans. It was about Harris. And so it's been a really interesting experience. The reaction it's gotten, I think, is very much colored by people's opinions before they even see the film. Like everybody comes to a film with their own baggage, and that was a strong lesson that I learned. So I'm much more hesitant to make cross-cultural films, I think, but that doesn't mean that I wouldn't, because I do think there are voices that need to be heard, and if I felt very strongly about making another film like that, I would. But it definitely, I feel like there's more. You can speak with more authority when it's coming from your own culture, And so even though it was Harris speaking, people were looking as though I was the one doing. That's one thing about animation, is that even with survivors, there's one statistic in that film where the expert says women on either end of the educational spectrum are more likely to be abused. So if you're very educated, like she has a PhD, or if you're very uneducated, you're more likely to be a victim of abuse. And people did not like hearing that. And they all wanted me to quote statistics. And yet when I spoke with live action filmmaking producers, they said they were never questioned about these statistics coming from the actual expert, because you see the expert, you see their credential written on the screen, and so they know it's coming from them, it's not coming from the filmmaker. Whereas with these films, they associate it more coming from me, even though it's somebody else's voice. So I feel like you have more responsibility to the audience in that situation. But that did teach me in Truth is Fallen to make sure that I had, a little subtitle so you could see everybody that was speaking, and give it a little bit, more authority on, understanding that this was coming from somebody who actually knew what they were talking about.
This is one of the things that happens with documentaries, especially documentaries that are about very polarizing topics like this one. And in the United States, in many ways, of course, the story was told as Serbs bad, Bosnians good, but then it became Bosnians Muslim, and hence the enemy, all kinds of twists and turns that are maybe tangential to your film, but inevitably encircle such films.
Yeah, they taint how people perceive it, that's for sure.
And I guess it must also have been quite painful, on the one hand, to see your fellow panelist criticized by the audience, but also quite painful to find yourself criticized by your fellow documentarians.
I had a lot of heated discussions with them. Um, but it really helped me learn to articulate all of the different issues in that film. So it was definitely a learning experience.
And we've got about 5 or 10 minutes left. So I wanted to ask you if you could tell us a little bit about your earlier projects, not perhaps individually, but collectively. What you were trying to do, what you were learning, what your influences were. But of course, if you want to refer to particular films, great.
Yeah, the very first film I ever made was called Manja, where I interviewed an Italian family about living with them. And that was the first time I worked with painting on glass animation. And that was made at the Rhode Island School of Design. And after I graduated there, I went to grad school at Cal Arts, and that's where I made Secret Rage, which is the black and white film about, this man appears one way on the surface, but internally he's going through all this conflict. And then Faith and Patience, which was probably, one of my more lighter films. Faith and Patience and Manja were my lightest films. And then it turned into darkness after that. But Faith and Patience was the first time I used an actual audio interview and animated to it, to the soundtrack. So that all kind of led me to where I am now. I sort of found that I really like that combination of documentary audio and interpreting it. And I'm so interested in the relationship of sound and image and how to create imagery that emphasizes the audio rather than distracts from it. For example, if the image is really beautiful, it can be distracting because you're watching more than you're listening. And so it's really important to me to try to find a balance between what's literal, what's abstract, what's a metaphor. I'm always searching for that. I've never completely, I'm no expert, but that's my goal, to always try to find that relationship so that you're more immersed in the audio when you're watching the animation. It helps you understand or empathize more with the person that's speaking rather than distracting you from it.
That's interesting. Can you talk a bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, as to me, it's so interesting. Like, for example, there was a scene in Truth Has Fallen where this man is describing how the SWAT team surrounded him and they held a gun up to his head and cocked the gun and he thought he was going to die. And it's like, what do you animate at that moment? And that moment, I thought the only thing I could animate was pure abstraction to try to express what he was feeling. Like, it didn't make sense just to show you what he was describing. And I feel like sometimes abstraction is the best way to help you sort of comprehend or feel what that person is feeling. And the film I'm working on next, I'm exploring that further, where I interview people with anxiety and talking about anxiety and depression and anger, and it's all painted on glass, pure abstraction, no literal imagery. Because I feel like I lean too heavily on the literal imagery, so I want to push myself creatively and try to learn how to use pure abstraction to describe what they're talking about. So that I hope will take me to the next level for the film after that. But I find that very, very interesting because I do think sometimes when you're animating something that's very literal, that's basically what the person is describing, it's a little bit redundant because you're seeing and hearing the same thing. So if you can add to that, like if it's a metaphor for what they're saying, then it gives it a little bit more dimension.
Lovely. Now, Prof, going back to your current situation, you and your beloved students and fellow faculty and supporters are in a state of shock.
Yes.
And in many cases, scrambling for work, for study, for a future, including, if I may say so, disgracefully let down students who have dedicated travel, time, money, and ideas. All of that said, I'm not asking you to endorse what I just launched into. Do you feel as though you need some time to take stock now? Or can you launch into something with a little more time on your hands than you'd expected?
Both of those things. I think all the faculty that are leaving USC have made a pledge to the students that we're still there for them. So I'm teaching, for example, one of the classes that many of them want to take, I'm teaching it for free online for them. So that'll help wean me out of teaching too. So I still get to work with them, and we've all agreed to mentor them too. So for the next 2 years, I'll still be working closely with those students that are remaining. But I also am kind of looking, this forced retirement will allow me to focus more on my own filmmaking too. And so that's been the most inhibiting factor is time. Animation is so time consuming, and to have the space, both mental and time wise space, to be able to focus on my work. I think I'm kind of looking forward to that. I'm looking forward to immersing myself in it and seeing where it takes me. So I'm optimistic about the future. I think this is kind of a new chapter for me, but I also love my students very much, and I won't abandon them either.
That's a wonderful, wonderful thing. So to finish up, Prof, is there anything you'd like to add? What might that take the form of? One, going back over terrain we've traversed, whether something more you'd like to say, and or two, something we haven't touched on, where you'd like to offer some remarks.
Well, I will say, I've been very, very lucky at being able to teach workshops in other parts of the world. And I do think that documentary animation in general has so much potential for so many different people. And it's exciting to see what's being produced from other countries with their own voices and their own hand. Traditional filmmaking can be very dangerous when you have to put yourself at risk. For example, in a war zone or something, you'd have to go take a camera and be very visible. Whereas animation allows you, number one, to keep the people you interview anonymous, and number two, it's a much safer way to portray the circumstances. So it's what's come out of independent filmmaking from all over the world has been very, very exciting. I think there's so much potential. So for me, it's really, really exciting to see what's happening elsewhere. And I love sharing all the work with my students, and voices that you don't normally get to hear from and understand in such an intimate way.
Well, thank you so much for spending this time with us. Your work is great, and it
Thank you
will
very
continue
much.
to be great. And I can only imagine the wonderful things yet to come, not only in terms of your own artistic practice, but also that of the students that you've worked with over the years and are continuing to work with in the time to come. It's been great.
Thank you so much.
Well, Prof, I'm trying to stop recording and it's not letting me. This is one of those funny moments, isn't it? Okay, finally, I'm allowed to say goodbye.